You are listening to the Signature Books podcast. Signature Books is a proud member of the Dialogue Podcast Network. You can support this podcast and others in our network by subscribing at dialoguejournal.com.
In one of the most unlikely coups in college basketball history, Brigham Young University signed basketball phenomenon AJ Dybantsa, the #1 high school player in the United States. Dybantsa's decision stunned the sports world, and AJ continues to garner national attention as he and his teammates are off to an impressive 8-1 start for the Cougars this season. I'm Barbara Jones-Brown, director of Signature Books. Our guests today are historians Matthew Bowman and Wayne LeCheminant. Their new book, Game Changers, AJ Dybantsa, BYU, and the Struggle for the Soul of Basketball, explores why it is that a player like Dybantsa, who had his pick of any college in the nation, chose BYU. In answering that question, the authors delve into recent court rulings and institutional reform that put money at the forefront of college sports in ways the American public has never before seen. And for generations before that, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints built a theological structure and institutional commitment to basketball that historically led to the sport being central in its youth and missionary programs, as well as at BYU. Game Changers places Dybantsa in the context of this history and culture and explores the tensions in the sport today. The book is now available in hardback, paperback, ebook, or audiobook format, with Utah Jazz legend Thurl Bailey narrating the audiobook. Matthew Bowman will be speaking and signing books at Signature Books in downtown Salt Lake City on December 18th. Doors open at 6:30 p.m. And now, on to the podcast. Matt Bowman and Wayne LeCheminant, thank you for joining the Signature Books podcast.
You're welcome.
Glad to be here.
Let's start by talking about that incredible game against Clemson yesterday, in which BYU came back from a 22-point deficit to win the game on a buzzer-beating shot by Rob Wright, who scored a three-pointer with 1 second left in the game or less. And AJ Dybantsa scored more points in the second half than the entire Clemson team combined. 22 points to Clemson's 21 points. Anyway, so I think that's just a great opener to start this podcast. Were you both watching that game?
I saw it afterward. Wayne, I don't know if you saw it live or not.
I did. I tuned in about halfway through, so just when the second half was starting.
Which was the good half.
Yes, which I almost wondered why I was even bothering at that point. But yeah, it was amazing.
I was lucky enough to just watch the second half as well, because for the first half I was at work. But yeah, great second half.
Matt and I have talked about is when and if, Dybantsa, as he goes through his basketball career here, when he's going to start taking over games. And I think we saw that in the second half, that he really does have the skills and the talent to take over a game and dominate in ways that most players cannot. That's what was really amazing about that half.
Yeah, BYU's only loss so far this season was to UConn, in which they were also down by, I think, as much as 26 at some point, and they came back and almost won that one. They lost just by 2 points, but because of Dybantsa's incredible second half performance. Well, let's talk about Dybantsa. For our listeners who might not know yet, AJ Dybantsa is a rising star. Can you both talk about him and who he is?
Yeah, AJ Dybantsa was born in Massachusetts. He is the son of two immigrants. His father is from the Republic of the Congo. His mother is from Jamaica. And really from his childhood, he has been sort of preternaturally gifted at basketball. He is often compared by basketball journalists to all-star players mostly Paul George is the comparison we mostly get. That is to say, he's long, he's strong, he's pretty lanky, he's got good reach, and he's a really, really gifted scorer. And it's been sort of observed that even when he was a teenager playing, his game is not only predicated on his athleticism, although he's certainly quite athletic, but he also plays smart, right? He plays like a player who is much older than the teenager that he is. There's a kind of smoothness and an intelligence to his game that's really outstanding. He was from years back, right? And I think one of the fascinating things that we may talk about basketball these days is how young players are identified, how young they are when the media and the basketball industrial complex gets a hold of them. But from the time he was a middle teenager, 15, 16 years old, he was pegged as probably a top 5 draft pick in next year's NBA draft. So because of
That's
that,
right.
there was lots of interest and lots of wondering about where he was going to go to college. And there was this great expectation, of course, that he would only go to college for 1 year because NBA regulations, right, prevent players from being drafted right out of high school. But the assumption was that he would go to a classic basketball powerhouse like Kansas, for instance, or University of North Carolina, one of these schools. But he picked BYU of all places, and why that is the real question.
Exactly. And I remember reading all of the news hype about Dybantsa when he was recruited by BYU and thinking, why on earth did he choose BYU? BYU is a solid basketball school, but not a standout school, as you write in your book, of course. So that was one question I had. And I thought there needs to be a book about this. Of course, Signature Books is a historical press. We publish about historical things, but I realized AJ Dybantsa is making Utah history by coming to BYU, right? And I just want to point out for our listeners who maybe aren't BYU fans, aren't even sports fans, keep listening because this book, Game Changers, AJ Dybantsa, BYU, and the Struggle of the Soul for the Soul of Basketball, is about so much more than just BYU basketball. So keep listening. So yeah, as you just pointed out, AJ Dybantsa, he was the #1 high school recruit in the United States. And the book opens with that and closes with that, of course. But there's so much more in between. And you've both written about the background that brought Dybantsa to BYU. How on earth, that's the question everyone has on their minds, is why on earth would somebody who's non-Mormon, who is the top recruit in the nation, choose a school like BYU? Wayne, do you want to talk a little bit about the background that kind of led that up to that?
Well, one is the larger background of just how college sports has changed, and the fact that now that there's NIL money, name, image, likeness money involved, and that players can be paid, certainly helps a school like BYU that has traditionally been a middling basketball program to even the playing field if they can get the money. And so that's part of it. But then perhaps the biggest part or biggest coup for BYU was getting Kevin Young as the coach, and we
Right.
discussed that in considerable length. But Kevin Young is a member of the LDS Church, and it was surprising that he decided to come to BYU as well, because he was the assistant head coach of Phoenix, and he's been pegged as being a head coach somewhere in the NBA and a rising star with a really great offensive mind. And then when BYU's coaching position opened for the men's basketball team, uh, BYU did a pretty incredible job of getting Kevin Young on board rather quickly.
And that leads to something I want to bring up. There's kind of a silent person behind all this. And of course, AJ Dybantsa, as you mentioned, came to BYU largely because of Kevin Young. Kevin Young came to BYU because of a woman, his wife, Melissa, right? And you write about this in your book, and it's Melissa that convinces him to go to BYU. Matt, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and this gets, I think, to some of the bigger questions that you were alluding to before, right? Which is to say, this real tension, I think, that has been felt, especially at BYU, but also, I think, among many kind of religious fans of basketball. And that is, Melissa Young wanted to go to BYU because she wanted the kind of lifestyle that she would have there. That is to say, Kevin would be home on Sundays. He was not home on Sundays when he was coaching in the NBA. In the NBA, he is traveling half the year. He's hardly ever home. There's all sorts of pressure. on him, but also a lot of uncertainty. Part of Kevin Young's basketball trajectory has been that as he's been rising in the NBA, he's been bouncing all over the country. He's 2 years in Phoenix, a few years in Philadelphia, um, back and forth and back and forth. There's no stability there. And what Melissa Young really wants for her family and what she had hoped that basketball might bring is a sense of stability and purpose and meaning. And she sees that at BYU, right? And this is something that BYU has long wanted basketball to do for them. They want sports generally, but basketball in particular, to promote the sense that sports is about family, sports is about building character, sports is about promoting all the virtues and the values of the church. Now, the other side of that coin, right, is what is happening increasingly is that sports is becoming about money and making more money and earning more money. AJ Dybantsa is only going to be at BYU for 1 year. Everybody knew that going in. That is not quite what people had hoped for, right? But he is at the same time bringing so much media coverage, like this book, and money to BYU in other ways, right? That it's this constant sort of trade-off, back and forth, something that people like Kevin Young and AJ Dybantsa are balancing their entire lives.
So let's talk a little bit about that, about money and sports and a religious school like Brigham Young University. There's these tensions there that you bring out in your book, right? How, a lot of people have questioned how a religious school like Brigham Young University, why is it jumping in the game with the big boys, so to speak, paying multi-millions dollars to its coach, Kevin Young, and to um, AJ Dybantsa as a top recruit. Of course, maybe we could talk a little bit about where that money is coming from. Is it coming from tithe payers? That's, I think some people are asking that question, and understandably they wouldn't be happy with that. So, Wayne, could you talk about where that money's coming from and maybe those tensions that are going on?
Well, BYU is enjoying the benefits of what they call collectives now, where boosters raise money to and donate money to a pot essentially that they can then use to pay recruits to come, and they also help, I guess, facilitate endorsement deals as well, or they can, and so BYU, its athletic department uh, does not get any money from tithing. And in fact, that's probably one of the big reasons why I decided to jump to the Big 12 as a conference. I mean, BYU without a conference would be really stuck. And one of the things that the Big 12 offers BYU is now that they're full participants this coming year in the Big 12 pot, they'll be getting at least 30 million a year from
Wow.
conference money, and that then they can use for their athletic department. And now it doesn't have to be distributed just to football or basketball or whatever. That's to use as they see fit. But it's at least 30 million. So that they'll be getting from conference money. Not to mention a lot more exposure.
Sorry, Wayne, that 30 million coming from conference money, where does that come from?
Oh, it comes from the conference, from TV rights and from basically from selling the games. And so they sell, yes, so they sell that their games to ESPN, for example, or to whoever. They have their own network as well, and to advertisers. And at some point, BYU also enjoys the boost of being in a conference that is getting a lot of television exposure compared to some of the other conferences, like when it was in the WAC conference or the Mountain West. I mean, Big 12 was a much bigger deal in terms of exposure, especially in important areas like Texas, right, where there's a lot of interest in football and basketball. So the money comes from these outside forces, I guess, so the collectives and the Big 12 conference. However, the tension that arises is, as we trace in the book, is that BYU leaders long saw BYU's sports as an opportunity to mold character, to mold young men and women into being productive, helpful, cooperative participants. And if we think of like some of the some of the past, as we were writing this, I often thought Hugh Nibley, as many people might know, right, a famous Mormon thinker, once wrote he wrote several scathing uh, critiques of a lot of LDS people going after money and idolizing money. And he had this one famous essay called, what was it, "Work We Must, but the Lunch is Free," and that was a real rebuke of how money operates, and not just in religious life, but in all of our lives, and how we've started idolizing it. And I wonder what he would think about BYU now deliberately going after, like, for example, Kevin Young has said that he wants to make BYU an NBA factory. And, so Dybantsa, as he sees it, is just the first of many that will come through, play their 1 year, make millions of dollars, and move on to the NBA. And that's a much different, I guess, template for how we're going to shape young men and women through sports.
Well, as a BYU alumni and BYU fan myself, I'm loving it. I've watched every game this season, largely a lot of it because after reading your book, I know all the backstory behind these players and the coaches. And so it's like really fun if you're personally invested in all these folks. So I'm enjoying it. But I have to say that your book changed how I saw this money. Because at first I was like, we heard that AJ Dybantsa is making $7 million between sponsorships and the collectives and from BYU itself. I was like, that's not right that an 18-year-old kid's making $7 million in 1 year, right? But then after reading your book and understanding how the NCAA used to control those funds, keep the money for itself, and learning how much money is incoming to the schools and to the NCAA based on people wanting to watch these college athletes, it completely changed my perspective. And I feel now absolutely these athletes should be making money. So it's changed my perspective, and I think it might change readers' perspectives as well. Matt, could you talk a little bit about just these recent changes in federal law that have led to college athletes? And this has just been in the last 5 years or so, right? But that's led to college athletes going from what was considered amateur players to now being able to make this kind of money.
Yeah, so this goes back right to the emergence of the NCAA and how the NCAA sort of defines and controls athletics. And really to this guy named Walter Byers, who more or less invented the modern NCAA, ran it for decades in the mid 20th century. And there's an interesting kind of a juxtaposition, I think, in Byers himself. On the one hand, right, it is absolutely true that he coined the term student athlete in order to protect the NCAA from lawsuits, to say, right, that we don't have to pay these students. They're not our employees, so we are not liable if they get hurt. All of this kind of stuff. But on the other hand, I think Walter Byers actually genuinely believed that there was something noble about amateurs, about people who played sports for the love of sports, who played sports because they thought sports would benefit their own lives, and not simply for kind of the crassness of income, right? So there's this odd kind of double-mindedness, but it's certainly true, I think, that certainly by the 21st century, right, the NCAA was more or less using that designation of amateur, to extract money from the performance of these students, to extract money from TV deals, as Wayne mentioned, especially more than anything else, right? It's broadcast rights. It's bringing the NCAA tons of money, and the students are just not getting any of this. They're not getting, they don't have the right, for instance, to license their own names and images and likenesses, to advertisers. They don't have the right, really, they're not being paid by their universities. And there are then a whole series of court cases that come down the line, really just over the last 15 years or so. Kind of beginning with Ed O'Bannon, who was on a UCLA Final Four team way back when, and who ended up one day just sort of seeing himself in a video game about the NCAA basketball, but it was clearly him, right? The little pixel character looked like him, it shot like him, but his name was nowhere on it. And he complained about this to some friends, and then ended up mounting a big lawsuit saying that he should get paid. The NCAA alone did not have the right to license this. Anyhow, all these court cases happen, and then but as of really just last year, last summer, is when a lot of this came down the line. Now players can license their name, images, and likeness. And as Wayne mentioned, right, a lot of these colleges are gathering together a whole crew of boosters to form collectives to simply give these students deals. And the schools that have the biggest boosters that can pay these students all these deals are getting money. Students can also be paid by the colleges as well. There's something called the transfer portal now that allows student athletes to move from one school to another fairly easily. In short, what all these court cases have meant is that NCAA college basketball looks a lot like the NBA now. Players can sign contracts, they can move, they can license their image and likeness to advertisers. They're becoming essentially professionals. The real question is, were they really, in some sense, always professionals? And many people on their side would say, yes, they are.
Right. They were professionals doing the same thing. You can play for the love of the game. I mean, Dybantsa shows that. You see his joy out there playing. You can play for the love of the game and still be making money. It's not like one or the other cancels, the other out. But so I want to ask both of you, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about that after writing this book, writing about basketball for years, in your case, at least, Matt? How do you feel about these changes? Do you feel like they're fair to the athletes?
Yeah, it's actually kind of a tricky question. I think of course the athletes deserved something, right? But at the same time, right, I am sympathetic to this deep vision that goes back even to the founder of basketball, James Naismith, right? The sense that this sport should be primarily about building character, and turning it into simply money um, is in some sense kind of altering and diluting that. It isn't, I think, a tricky question. And it shows, I think, more than anything else. And this is why, you will hear some people complain sometimes about, oh, how much are these athletes getting paid? They don't deserve that much. They don't deserve that much. But as you said earlier, Barbara, that's just the money that is there, right? That money is in the marketplace. And if they are not getting it, someone's going to be getting it. What I am quite skeptical of is, I guess, how much money is there. And what that shows are kind of like the imbalance of our society at a broad systemic level, right? We are a society that has poured so much money into professional athletics. While, for instance, um, the public school near my house is having a fundraiser to put new tile on the bathroom floors, right? That shows, I think, that there's something maybe off in the way that our culture is organized. That doesn't say anything about AJ Dybantsa, right? AJ Dybantsa is playing the game that's in front of him. Maybe the game should be changed. I don't know, but he's just one cog.
Your thoughts on that, Wayne?
Yeah, it is very interesting. One of the things that we talk about in the book is, and I think that we've seen this certainly from like the Michael Jordan era on, and now people like Dybantsa have the ability to do it. Is that individuals are not just getting compensated for playing a sport, which, and by the way, I college players, college athletes should be getting a lot of this money, I guess, from their efforts in the old days where the NCAA just took all of it, or the conferences or schools just took it all. Seems a little unfair. However, now individuals are becoming brands, right? We talk about the idea that Dybantsa and his family have received advice from people like Leonard Armato, Shaquille O'Neal's advisors, and from Shaq himself about how to actually brand yourself, right? So you're not just playing a sport; you're becoming an entity. That one of the things that you do is play a sport as a means to make a lot of money. And now there's certainly a lot of joy to be felt as a fan when you get to watch somebody. I mean, I love watching basketball, and I think it's a beautiful sport. It's amazing to watch how these athletes are able to do what they do. But it is also at the same time when you come back to earth and you realize that they have this talent or skill that they're using to become some sort of corporate, I guess, international brand. I don't know personally what I think of that, if that's good or bad, or maybe that's still some of the naive, childlike thinking I have that, oh, they only do this because they love the game. And I don't begrudge anybody from making as much money as you can, I guess, from uh, playing or doing whatever talent you have. Though, like Matt said, it does make me wonder when our society is moving more and more that way. and we seem to be encouraging it. I mean, in some sense, Dybantsa is a product of what we've all wanted, right? Is we want as much of these athletes as we can consume. We want to see them on lunch boxes, on TV, playing a sport, selling things. And so I guess the fact that not just Dybantsa, but that all these athletes and the way that money is becoming so central to college sports is seemingly to me just a reflection of how society itself is moving. I think we can look at our political world right now, and we see that it's just as much about money as anything else, and the haves have it and the have-nots do not.
Right. Yeah. And I love that you're bringing up these tensions. Yeah. And then on the other side, I love that it's a success story of an immigrant family, chasing and achieving the American dream. AJ's dad is an immigrant from Congo. His mother is an immigrant from Jamaica. And I love to see them following the dream, working hard, and helping AJ get to where he is today. So let's move on and talk about religion and sports. Um, Talk about you mentioned a little bit earlier, Matt, James Naismith and the invention of basketball and how he was working at the YMCA, and it was considered a religious sport, if you will, and that it developed character, teamwork, camaraderie. Talk about basketball's origins as a religious sport, and then maybe talk about how BYU, BY Academy at the time outlawed football and that basketball stepped into the breach.
Yeah, yeah, and this is kind of fun, right? Because of course, when we talk about like kind of amateurism and basketball builds character and all of that, um, some listeners might be hearing that and think, oh, that's a bit of a stretch. But in fact, that is explicitly why basketball was invented. It was intended as a moral exercise by the man who created it, James Naismith, who was a sort of a minister and an employee of the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association in Massachusetts in the 1890s. It was very cold one winter. His students could not play outside, so the director of the YMCA school where he taught asked him to develop a game that would promote Christian virtue that could be played indoors. And Naismith comes up with basketball. And he writes actually essays upon essays about how basketball is designed to teach morality. It is a cooperative game, Naismith says. It is a game in which a single person trying to accomplish everything himself will actually lead to his team losing. And that, incidentally, of course, is a critique that we often hear about basketball today, right? This is why James Harden never won a championship on the Rockets, because he was too egotistical, right? So this language that Naismith coins is still very much embedded in how we talk about the sport today. And this is then why it is, as you say, adopted by BYU, because football was outlawed for about 15 years at BYU. That may be a surprise to people, but it was because I think in the early years of football, as football developed out of rugby and became this sort of American version of the sport, in the 1890s and first decade of the 20th century, dozens of people were killed playing football. There were college games in which students had died. It was a fairly common occurrence, actually. I found one incredible newspaper article from Ogden, Utah, describing an upcoming football match between two public schools, and the article notes that there will be doctors on site, and we already have crutches available. So don't worry about your sons as they come to play this game, right?
This was before they had the helmets and the equipment that they have today to protect them,
Correct.
right?
Yes, and before some rule changes happened, right? But eventually, the leaders of the church decide. Well, and in the announcement in which they say football will no longer be played at church schools, they're using language like, football is a game that encourages brutality. It is a game that appeals to the animal instinct in humans, right? It devolves us morally and makes us evil and terrible and rough people. And then basketball comes in. So football is banned. Basketball then becomes the game that especially male students in BYU start playing. It was actually known as kind of a woman's sport in this area prior to that, because all the virtues that it promoted, virtues of kind of cooperation and self-sacrifice and so on, were kind of labeled as female virtues at this point.
And also because it was a less violent sport, right? It was considered a woman's game quite a bit at first. And Brigham Young Academy, its first basketball team was a team of women who
Precisely.
won the championship. Is that right? I loved
Precisely,
how you
right?
talked about the history of women in the sport as well in the
Yeah,
book.
yeah, and as I think kind of so often happens, right? When football was banned, the men kind of came in and took it over, and and made the sport a man's sport, right? And BYU hires this athletic director named Eugene Roberts, who eventually on and off coaches the basketball team as well. And he really, he hires a women's basketball coach and just says, "You run the women's team. I'm not interested in that. I'm going to run the men's team." And he more or less kind of embeds basketball into the culture of BYU and makes it a real kind of critical sport. And eventually, of course, he brings back football once the equipment sort of catches up to the game. And it's really from Eugene Roberts that football and basketball become the leading sports at BYU.
Fascinating. And you do get into in your book the development of basketball to what it is today. Over the years, you talk about for BYU sports fans, you'll enjoy reading about Jimmer, Fredette, Danny Ainge, Kazimir Kosic. It's all there. So Stan Watts as a coach. So that's all there. Let's talk a little bit more about how basketball was so embraced by the church that today, as you pointed out to me, there's a basketball court in every LDS church, pretty much across the United States and elsewhere. And I thought, that is kind of strange. Why is that? So maybe, Wayne, could you talk about the church's embrace of basketball after this point and how they used it in missionary work and in its young people's programs and so forth?
Well, as members of the church will know, and as I guess a lot of even non-members would probably know, is that the LDS Church has long had uh, struggled with being accepted by the culture at large, right? Especially here in America, that in fact the LDS Church was not an odd church, and this is primarily in the 20th century I'm talking about, and that in fact Mormons are, good, upstanding citizens, Americans. They love, family, church, America, and so forth. And then likewise, when they went on their missionary efforts, how do we project the fact that joining the LDS Church is not something that's dangerous or that's subversive. Um, and so to get this acceptance, one of the things that it seems that the many members of the church did was, in fact, endorse or promote sports, right? Because sports is certainly sort of an equalizing force. And one of the things that, in fact, or the LDS Church had a huge amateur basketball tournament, as people may or may not know, that was held by the church, and all the different stakes throughout the country would compete in their ward teams, and then eventually there would be a championship. A lot of these young men who played and participated in sports go off and serve missions, and they uh, one of the things that you can do is play a sport with locals, and we, in fact, go through some of the examples of how in Australia and other places that, in fact, there was a lot of success for missionaries that they participated in a really high level sports with while they were on their missions. And by the way, just to talk briefly, I served my mission in Korea, and even in Korea, most of the places, if they did not have because the buildings were constructed differently than they are here, they still had basketball courts outside. Uh, and, basketball was not, when I was on my mission, basketball was not considered a huge sport, but we even used basketball as a way to, on our P days, we'd invite non-members and so forth to come play with us, and we'd play basketball. So it really was, and it was a way in which you could, I guess, rather in a non-threatening manner or something like that, just do something that was fun together and show everybody that you're just one of the guys, and then eventually invite them to have a discussion.
We recently published a biography on Wallace Stegner, Dean of Western Writers. And I was amazed because I was editing your book at the same time as I was reading through this book later. And it said that Wallace Stegner, when his family moved, the Pulitzer Prize winning writer Wallace Stegner moved to Salt Lake City, Utah with his family as a non-Mormon. He got involved in going to church activities and participating in the church through basketball. He was invited to play, on these church ball with these local teams and loved it. And so spent a lot of time in LDS churches playing basketball. So that was kind of a fascinating read.
And that is intentional, right? There are a lot of guidelines from church leaders, and we're talking in the 19 teens and 1920s and 1930s here, directing wards to put basketball courts in their buildings because they say, this is a way we can draw the young men in, both members and non-members. They will come into the church building, and then we can sort of socialize them. And basketball will teach them all of these LDS values of cooperation and self-sacrifice and so on and so forth, right? So it is again, as with James Naismith, very explicit that this is a sport that will promote religion.
That's fascinating. Of course, Wallace Stegner never became a Latter-day Saint, but he did have a great respect for the church because of that association as a young man. Wrote a couple of books about LDS history, so that accomplished that aim, if you will. Another if I could wax personal for a moment, my grandpa and his brothers, two of his brothers, they were called the Jones Boys. They won that all church basketball tournament. I believe it was in 1940. And we still have the trophy from that's passed down through our family. It's kind of passed around my cousins. But I never realized what a big deal that all church tournament was until I read your book. So Wayne, you started talking about it. Could you talk a little bit more about how big a deal that was?
I was surprised too, to tell you the truth, until doing more of the research. I played church ball like many people who grew up in the church, and I don't. It seems like it's really kind of fallen out a little bit. But I remember we had a tournament within our stake, and then I think then the winner of our stake took on somebody else, another stake.
Stake being a large congregation.
Yes, of multiple wards, which are just smaller, congregations. The nationwide tournament was shocking, right? And finding out more about it, that in fact it was all the wards, throughout the United States would compete in this on a stake level, and then eventually send their champions or whatever to play a tournament in Utah, where they had the ultimate. I guess your grandfather, ultimately won the championship, and so this was a big deal. And in fact, it was the largest basketball tournament in the United States prior to the NCAA tournament. It precedes that, and the NIT. So the church was in fact a real trailblazer when it came to large basketball tournaments. In fact, it was the largest tournament to be held anywhere in for just basketball.
That was incredible to learn.
And also, if you think about too, at the time, the NBA doesn't start until 1948. The NBA was nothing in a sense compared to what it is today. College basketball was certainly more popular for a long time than the NBA was, but the fact that the LDS Church was able to organize such a large and well participated in tournament for basketball was uh, amazing. And it does show, as Matt was just mentioning, the church's deliberate use of basketball as a means to help mold the youth, to help generate interest from non-members, and to just participate in the larger culture. And I can only imagine. I don't know what the original the people, when they were thinking about starting the NCAA tournament, were looking at, but I imagine they probably looked at the LDS Church's success, at how they were able to get together a tournament in which people participated and people watched, and it was a big deal for a sport that was nowhere near as popular as football at the time.
Well, this is the first book, but I'm sure not the only book that has been written about AJ Dybantsa. And again, all of the background that led to him coming to BYU. That's the primary question that I see in interviews with him. People ask over and over and over again, why BYU? People can read this book and come away knowing that answer. So I'm sure there'll be future books written about Dybantsa. He's got a bright future, an incredible future ahead of him. But what will readers get from your book that they or learn from your book that they couldn't learn anywhere else thus far?
Yeah, so I wrote something on social media a little bit ago about how this book contains within it AJ Dybantsa, but also Jimmer Fredette, and also Operation Underground Railroad, and also Spencer W. Kimball, right? This sort of odd constellation of people that are all coming together in this moment, and this sort of legacies, I think, of this moment, are particular, right? I mean, I'm primarily a historian of religion who's a big fan of basketball. Wayne is a trained kind of political scientist who's a fan of basketball, and I think the sensibilities that we brought to telling this story mean the Dybantsa story. Certainly, there's a lot of basketball in this book, right? You can read descriptions of games in this book. You can read a lot of stuff about Magic Johnson and Larry Bird and so on and so forth. But there's also this kind of broader cultural and historical context in it, starting as we do with James Naismith and going as far back as we do to the Congo. There's a fair amount in this book about the history of the Congo and where Dybantsa's family came from that you might not see in other books down the line, too.
Like Matt said, I think the most interesting thing about putting this book together and thinking about it, and Matt and I were talking about it, is as Matt just mentioned, the different sort of constellations or that have come together to this, right? So, for example, the fact that Matt mentioned Spencer W. Kimball, the fact that the LDS Church reversed its ban on black people holding the priesthood was an important step, right? So that to I guess showing the world that everybody was accepted at BYU, regardless of your race and so forth, and that is a big deal, and that eventually. Um, what you'll find in this book is the ways in which all these things come together to create the moment that we're in now. And it's one that I guess when I was a teenager, I would not have expected that BYU would be getting the kind of attention it does right now in terms of getting the number one recruit in basketball. And and it's not just Dybantsa. There's already a spillover effect, right? So Robert Wright came to BYU to play with Dybantsa, the guy who hit the game-winning shot last night, and he is an excellent player who could have, gone to any other school, and he was already a starter at Baylor where he was playing. He's and they're going to get top-notch recruits now because of this, and it makes BYU into already a burgeoning powerhouse that's going to have to, and other schools are going to have to contend with how do we stop BYU from getting the players that we want. So what I find interesting is that Matt and I look at how the history has helped to create this moment, and now that the church and fans and everybody's going to have to come together to decide what do they want BYU athletics to look like, what do they want the church to look like, or is everybody happy with the church sponsoring an institution that's competing, at, at I guess what maybe say like some sort of crass capitalistic exercise, or does BYU want to go back to being unrecognizable as a basketball program? They've pushed all their chips in, and they have said with Kevin Young, and he's a very seemingly upstanding person. AJ Dybantsa is the perfect, he seems like a really good, solid kid, somebody who has his head on straight, somebody who comes from a good family. He says all the right things, and he seems to also do the right things. He's a good person. So this experiment has come together with the two right people to help start it, and I think that that's something that Matt and I try to show the reader, that this is bringing about a change that we'll have to see what the results are. But you couldn't have started with two better people.
I don't know Kevin Young personally, but I've had the privilege of working with the Dybantsa family. With this book, I needed to, because of the new name, image, and likeness laws, I needed to get their permission and their buy-in to use AJ's photo on the cover of the book and use AJ's name in the title of the book. And so through working with them and going through the book with them and having them, we were so fortunate, Chelsea and Ace Dybantsa looked at the chapters that you had written about their family, and they had a few little things here and there that they're like, well, this isn't quite right, or this could be a little bit more accurate this way. Of course, we made those changes. not in terms of interpretation, but just in terms of factual aspects about their family. But long story short, working with them, I've been so impressed with the good people that they are. And you can read about that, of course, in news stories and in your book. But knowing them personally now, I can attest to they really are really solid, genuine, good people who care about their family and care about their son. AJ has been required to be on the honor roll, he and his sisters, or they don't get to play their sport growing up. And I thought it was interesting. AJ's first term at BYU, it's spring term, he got a 4.0. So he's still doing the same thing, excelling in school while he's excelling in basketball. Really high quality people.
He had the same requirement when he was in high school.
And elementary school
Yeah,
and junior high,
all the way
right?
back. Yep, all the way back.
Yeah, he and his sisters. Matt Bowman, Wayne LeCheminant, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
It was my pleasure.
Their new book is called Game Changers, AJ Dybantsa, BYU, and the Struggle for the Soul of Basketball. I should point out that it was the audiobook version was narrated by Utah jazz legend Thurl Bailey. So people that prefer audiobooks will really enjoy listening to him. He's got a fantastic voice. I've enjoyed listening to the audiobooks now. Matt Bowman will be in town in Salt Lake City from Claremont, California on Thursday, December 18th, speaking at Signature Books and signing copies. So we invite all of you listening to come and join us at Signature Books, downtown Salt Lake City, Thursday, December 18th. Look forward to seeing you there, Matt.
Yeah, excited to do it.
And until then, thank you for joining us.